All right, there we go. All right, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about continuing our talk about environments. We're going to talk about specifically soil and talk about the different aspects of soil and how it helps determine what organisms can grow and the kind of advanced, ecosystems that are occurring in soil. Because you may think of it as just dirt, but soil in itself is a very complex combination of animals as well as plant matter and nutrients and things that help, environments.
Prof. Diaz, can I make a quick announcement?
Of course.
So I just want to draw everyone's attention to the fact that CEQs that system is now open and available. So you can go, you could have gone, I guess, starting a couple days ago, and you should have received a link from the registrar's office. If not, we can drop it in the Moodle, and probably we should do that. Okay, so I'm just going to give you my quick speech on CEQs. We'll take a little time on Monday in class to kind of give you space to do them there, just because we do like to get as high a response rate as possible. Even for those of you who are first years, you've already gone through one round of these, but I'll just say it again. You've probably heard it before. This is the only way that teaching is evaluated at Vassar. So we don't have colleagues sitting on classes or other sorts of things. So you have a pretty serious responsibility when it comes to filling out CEQs and kind of reflecting thoughtfully on your experience in the course, your effort in the course. The quantitative part of those CEQs, where you're actually filling out the numerical answers, is the part that is actually used in tenure considerations and things like that. The written portion of it is completely anonymous unless you decide that you want to sign your name, and you're of course welcome to do that. That only we see, right? So in the written portion, whatever you write there, only Prof. Diaz and I will read. And we welcome kind of your thoughts, what worked, what didn't work, because that helps us, become better teachers. We've been also listening to sort of Yasser's comments as things go, and that helped us become better teachers. But please, it should take 5-10 minutes of your time, right? What we do not want is just sort of like a high graded sample size of those of you that are most excited about it. We really want to know what each and every one of you experience in the course, because that's how we get better, right? And that's how we hold ourselves accountable. And yeah, we're stressed about it, just like you guys are stressed about quizzes. We get stressed about CEQs, don't you worry. And so I tell myself what I tell you about quizzes and stuff. I am not a number. But anyway, yeah, just take them seriously. You can go start, you could go today if you wanted to. On Monday, we'll make some time in class, okay? And on out of your hair.
All right. Thank you. Very good points. So we'll give you time on Monday to do that. Yeah. All right. So
these are nematodes, tiny, round worms. Scientists think there may be up to 500,000 species of these wriggling in the soil. There are mites, tiny relatives of spiders and scorpions. Tardigrades, often called water bears due to their cute appearance.
cute.
And rotifers, fascinating little creatures that can propel themselves through the soil using special hairs that appear to revolve like a wheel.
right? So soil is not just dirt, right? It is its own underground ecosystem, right? As they just said in that video, there are nutrients in the soil that are not only important for plant life, but for fungi. Fungi are helping in the nitrogen cycle, right? They're acting as decomposers. They're at returning organisms to the soil and dirt like that. And then there are all of those microorganisms that are each providing their own part of the food web. They're providing nutrients, they're eating things. Worms in particular are turning soil, digesting it, breaking it down. And so we're going to talk about these different organismal roles in the environment and what soil provides and how it interacts with plants, right? So soil contains a living complex ecosystem. And, there are a lot of different types of soil, right? You tend to think of like dirt for your garden as very different from, say, sand or even clay, but all of those are different forms of soil, right? They're all versions of dirt with varying amounts of water and other types of materials in it. But most importantly, we were talking about how plants help dictate what can grow in an environment. But most importantly, soil is what determines what plants can grow, right? Without soil, you can't have the ability to hold on to materials. You don't have anything for plants to hold themselves into the ground with, to anchor themselves, as well as to get nutrients. And so, we were talking about the idea of primary and secondary succession, right? In primary succession, you need a buildup of soil to occur before you can have plants and other, higher level organisms, omnivores, things like that, living in your environment. And so plants are gathering from their soil primarily two different types of materials, two nutrients rather, besides water, obviously. But they're taking phosphorus, right, in order to make energy, to make ATP, as well as their DNA and things like that. And then nitrogen to make proteins, enzymes, all of that. And so in primary succession, we talked about how soil is initially created very often through erosion of rock, right? So if you have a volcano erupting, you have magma that's flowing, you then have that magma that is going to be broken down by erosion into smaller particles. And slowly, as you have those particles become smaller and smaller, you start creating soil, right? You start going from rocks to pebbles to gravel to soil. And so that can happen because of erosion, but also because, water will naturally freeze. And when it freezes, it'll expand and it'll cause rocks to break. And so water in itself will do that. Also, weak acids will break down rocks slowly but surely, right? If you have, say, salt or something in an environment, it gets wet, it'll become a weak acid, and those will actually help weather down rocks, further turning them into soil. And so there's this natural cycle that's happening because of abiotic factors, but there are also organisms which help break down rock through chemical and mechanical means, right? You have organisms that are digging through the dirt, they're turning it, they're breaking it down, and things of that nature. So for instance, as plants are trying to dig through dirt, they will secrete acids and help loosen up soil and even dissolve rock, depending on the species. And that's part of why you have these, in succession, you have these different layers of plants which are starting to live in an environment, right? As you have weeds and things building up, those would be plants that are more likely to dissolve rock and either be able to live in the environment or slowly help to destroy the rock and build it up. And so there are, a large range of what we would call dirt particles, soil particles, right? So the first and foremost, the one that's in the middle is silt. Silt is closer to what we would consider like an optimal type of soil for plant growth. On the full ends of the spectrum, you have sand, which are the largest type of dirt. You don't really think of sand as dirt, but it is made up of the same materials, right? Sand is inhospitable for plants most of the time because the molecules are so large that it doesn't create a very sturdy structure for most plants to live in. But also, generally speaking, because sand is so molecules are so thick, they actually don't hold water very well. And so plants will often dehydrate because if they're in sandy soil. If you play Animal Crossing, you can't plant flowers in sand. They will not grow. They will only grow in dirt. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have clay, though. And so you may not think of clay as dirt, but clay is extremely small, fine particles of dirt. And they're so small that they hold on to water and they keep oxygen out very well, which is how clay is so heavy and dense. It's thick, it has water in it, and that is also a bad environment for plants. Plants aren't generally growing in clay. In clay, and the problem is that when plants try to live in clay, they can't grow through it because it's too dense, and they also won't be able to, they'll have too much water. You can plant plants in sand in Animal Crossing, but they won't grow anymore. If you like run over them or like pick them, they're not going to grow in sand anymore. Unfortunately, they used to. I tried. And so clay contains these tiny, densely packed particles, and then sand has these huge particles, right? And so this triangle is what we kind of look at when we're looking at different types of particle size and their relation to each other. So, right, there's not going to be a single type of particle in an environment. There's going to be varying amounts of rocks that are broken down, varying amounts of sand and clay in their environment. And so this triangle is looking at the percentage of, say, clay versus silt versus sand in an environment. And so, as we said, this picture is looking at size of particles. You have really big particles of sand here. You have little small particles of clay, and then you have this silt that is more of an intermediate particle. And so, as I said, plants are actually nourished by soil solution, right? Similar to how we have, that extracellular matrix of fluid that's keeping nutrients floating around. You can think of that as also existing in soil, right? There's water that's pumping through. There's different levels of size and particle distribution throughout that, right? And plants are actively looking to ignore areas that have poor nutritional value, right? And so soil solution is both the water and the dissolved materials in the pores between particles. And so, clay and salt and sand and silt are not, absorbing these particles except maybe water. But what they're doing is they're acting as a medium in which that solution is sitting. And so soil nutrition is half water and half air, right? In the terms of sand, you have too much air and it's hard to hold on to water. In terms of clay, you have too much water and you can't get much air into it because it's so put together. What loam is it's a combination of these different types of silt and clay and sand, right? It's composed of a combination. And so loam is what you generally is most advantageous or easiest for plants to grow in. It generally has a mixture of particle sizes. Again, it's a combination of silt and clay. And so this combination of particle sizes leads to adequate adhesion and retention of both water and materials. And so you don't really think about it, but soil actually needs to hold on to materials, right? It needs to have space and it needs to have a charge in order to keep, phosphorus and nitrogen adhere to it or in close vicinity, right? If you don't have soil's ability to hold on to nutrients, then as water flows through them or as water dehydrates and dries out, you're going to have a loss of these nutrients, right? They're just going to be washed away. And so you want loam in order to have this type of material staying there. But again, clay and sand are bad for plants. Sand doesn't hold water, clay holds too much water and not enough oxygen. And so generally we're hoping to create something like this clay loam or this other loam, just in terms of particle size and distribution. And so when we look at soil, Just like when we look at strata for fossils and things like that, we have different horizons or different levels. And as you can see, there's a distinct coloration as well as consistency difference between soil that's near the top where plants are growing and then everything that's occurring lower on. You know, in the A horizon, this top level, that's where you're going to find worms and things of that nature and most organisms. And so Horizon C, we're going to start at the bottom and move up to the top, as the top is what's most important for ecosystems in general. But the bottom is composed of partially broken down rock. These molecules are much bigger than the ones above them. Again, this is more akin to sand, larger particles. As you move closer to the surface, you start to have more and more organic matter. But it's still less weathered, right? So this area down here isn't going to be broken up as much as the upper levels, but they're going to be more weathered than the sea below it, right? So as we get closer to the surface, there's more water, there's more breaking down of chemicals secreted by organisms and things like that. The topsoil is generally what we're most concerned with. And when you go into Bio 108, you're actually going to be taking soil samples from the topsoil and looking at the different biodiversity and organisms found in them. And so topsoil is where plants would like to grow. It consists of mineral particles, living organisms, and what's known as humus. And not delicious chickpea hummus. This is a gross combination of soil solution and animals. So humus, talk about in a minute, but again, we're talking about soil solution, right? So in this topsoil areas where you're going to find a mixture of inorganic compounds and organic compounds, right? You're going to find the soil solution, and then mixed in there, you're going to have this humus, which is the remains of dead organisms and other organic matter. So this is, you know, decomposing flowers, decomposing leaves, dead organisms, other organic molecules that are being broken down. And so this humus is what's very, very important in order for plant health. If you don't have a proper cycling of, as we talked about, phosphorus, nitrogen, all of these important biogeochemical cycles, you're not going to have a sustainable system, nor are you going to have plants able to grow. And so these horizons usually dictate what is growing and what organisms are living in there. Let's see. Oh, we have a question. So what are the soil horizons in aquatic environments? I'm not actually sure about that. I'm assuming that there is a similar type of breakdown obviously, because there's more water, you probably have these horizons and other areas be a lot thicker. But it also definitely varies in aquatic environments based on how deep you are, right? So like if you're on the edge of a lake, you're probably going to have areas that are very similar to this. Maybe you're going to have more of a clay level. You probably are going to have smaller molecules because they've been broken down more and they're going to retain more water. You know, if you just dump water on the soil, it'll flow out, right? But it'll just flow in and get absorbed. But if you have clay or something, that's when you're more likely to retain a large body of water. And so I would assume it's something like that. And they're probably much more complicated soil distributions at the bottom of the ocean and things like that, where you're going to have pressure differences and very different remnants of microorganisms. But I'm assuming there is, you know, a layer that is most broken down and hospitable for plants, and then layers on the bottom that are a little bit more isolated. And so when we're looking at organic components, you know, we have organisms, obviously. So you have fungi, isopods, insects, all of those little microbiotes, those prokaryotes that are sitting in there. So for instance, you know, 1 teaspoon of soil contains about 5 billion bacteria. If you take 108 and you start doing the biodiversity lab and you look at the soil, you calculate the number of bacteria that you've grown off your plate and use that to figure out how much soil bacteria must have been in the soil, you're going to come up with millions upon billions of bacteria. They're so small and it's very crazy to think about, but there are so many of them. You then have organisms such as earthworms, bacteria and fungi, which are decomposing as well as turning soil. So for instance, earthworms, this is a giant earthworm. This is someone's hand, and this is how big these earthworms are. I just think it's crazy how, we think of these small ones, but, you pretty much have an Alaskan bollworm here. They're huge. But they not only do they excrete waste, so they're adding nutrients back into the environment, but they move large amounts of material to the soil surface. So for instance, worms, you actually, if you're trying to have a garden in your backyard, you're gonna need worms. Why? Not only do they excrete waste that is useful for plants, they're putting other materials, nitrogen and things back into the soil, but they're actually digging and moving soil between the different horizon levels, right? They're digging down, they're digging up, and they're turning the soil and mixing it up. And so they move organic matter into deeper areas of the horizons, right? If a worm is at the top, it eats something, it starts digging down, it starts pooping, it's going to start excreting waste and moving materials as well as any dirt that it's dragging with this. And so the humus is this organic material produced by decomposing leaves, dead organisms, feces, and other bacteria and fungi. And this is what's providing and allowing the soil to hold nutrients as well as creating a cycle. Just like we have these, food webs and these trophic levels above ground, we have these exact same ideas underneath the dirt in this humus, in this organic material. And so the humus increases the soil's capacity to exchange cations and other important molecules. So cations being phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur, all of these different types of ions that would be in the soil that organisms are going to need to pull up. And so humus also helps separate clay particles, right? So there's going to be a little bit of clay in most soil as long as it gets broken down enough. And so having this humus there is actually acting as a way of preventing clay from sticking to itself too much. And it forms a nice crumbly soil that, again, is somewhere in between clay and sand, right? It's crumbly and it retains water, but it's also porous enough that organisms can move through it as well as absorb water and things. And so the topsoil composition also has these inorganic compounds, right? The plant must absorb these nutrients through the soil because it can't take them in directly, right? It's not eating anything. They're getting energy from the sun and they need to get their nutrients from the soil. And so most soil particles are negatively charged. And so negatively charged nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfate are lost through leaching in the soil, right? So they're not sticking to the soil because they're negatively charged, right? And so they can be pushed throughout the soil. Potassium, calcium, and magnesium, however, actually are positively charged and they attach to the soil. And so these different important molecules, so when we look at, say, these negatively charged ones, phosphate, nitrate, and sulfate, right? Those are all things that are going to be produced and brought into the soil by bacteria, right? Bacteria are naturally going to do nitrogen fixation. They're going to take nitrogen out of the air and then produce ammonia and put it into the soil as one of their molecules, as one of their waste products. That's if you don't have a continual cycle of these bacteria doing that and fungi and stuff, you're going to have a loss of those nutrients through water, which is why you need those organic compounds there. However, for potassium, calcium, and magnesium, they tend to become attracted to soil particles and they stick to them. And so root hairs that are growing through from the plant can actually exchange nutrients with the environment. They can absorb these different magnesium and calcium through the environment. I'm honestly not sure why soil particles are innately negative. I'm not sure if Prof. Aiken knows that. So I'm not actually sure how to answer that question. I'm not sure why they are negative. I'm sure it has something to do with the composition of rock and their ability to leach electrons, but I'm not sure, to be honest. And so minerals enter the soil solution through exchange. So these cations, deconnect from the soil, flow through water and other types of minerals, and then can be absorbed by the hairs of the soil. And so whether or not you have the presence of these molecules will determine what type of plants are able to grow and if they're able to grow at all. And so roots acidify the soil by releasing carbon dioxide, right? So you have it being pumped into the soil by, by the plant from respiration. It's going to be underground. These root hairs are going to be undergoing some type of respiration, providing a little bit of their own energy. Obviously, you're going to be pumping sugars and stuff to them. But while they undergo respiration, they're going to be producing CO2, and it's pumped into the soil. And then the CO2 reacts with water to form different types of bonds, which releases, these different types of molecules into it. Once you have those ions in the soil solution neutralizing the negative charge of the soil particles, you then have these release of these minerals as you have the anions, the hydrogen ions reacting with them. And after you do that, these molecules are now being released from the soil. The hydrogen, the protons are acting with them, removing that bonding, and then the roots are able to absorb the released cations. Let's see. Yeah. And that makes sense in terms of soil pH, right? The different proportions of these chemicals are going to create a more or less acidic environment or more or less basic environment, right? Especially as the plant is producing these different types of particles, these protons, right? And so there are essential elements that are necessary for a plant to complete its life cycle and reproduce, right? We've talked about a lot of these different nutrients. And so, as we said, plants absorb many types of nutrients from the soil. There are upwards of 50 different chemical elements in soil that plants cannot produce themselves, right? And so there are a lot of different ways that we test this, right? So one thing that's really interesting is that scientists have been working on hydroponic culturing. So the idea of growing plants in water without soil. And so one thing that's necessary for that is we need to figure out what chemicals are actually necessary in order to keep those plants growing. Because again, if you can have enough water, but not too much for the plant, and it doesn't mess with its osmoregulation, as long as you have the right nutrients, plants don't technically need the soil. But, in most natural environments, the soil's not going to, that water is going to be losing and flowing and probably not providing a constant source of each of these nutrients. Right. And so by doing hydroponic culturing, we can actually mix and match what chemicals are in water and see what exactly are necessary for plants to survive. And so there are macronutrients, so things such as oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, they're not macro because they're big, they're macro because plants need a lot of them in order to survive. Plants need a constant source of carbon dioxide and hydrogen and nitrogen and oxygen in order to survive. Survives. How do the roots not suffocate? Soil, not only does clay hold too much water, is that there's not enough oxygen. So in these setups for hydroponics, they're cycling amounts of water, and they're also including more oxygen and other nutrients in the water. So it's not just basic water. There's more in it, and it's more of a soil solution type of thing. And so you have these macronutrients, so nutrients that plants need a lot of, which constantly need to be provided. You know, if you think about it, nitrogen, phosphorus are part of those important cycles. They are constantly being cycled by organisms in their environment. And then you have micronutrients, which are these other molecules that are necessary for survival, but don't need to be constantly provided or in large amounts. So things such as iron, chlorine, zinc are all important for making various molecules, but are something that can be added in small amounts in your environment. And again, that's why partially we're not talking about a chlorine or ion or zinc cycles, right? Small amounts of these inorganic materials are usually found in environments. And so again, each type of plant is going to need varying amounts of chlorine, iron, and zinc, and all of these other things, right? If you think about it, all of these organisms are allocating resources, right? And so depending on where the species can grow will determine what kind of chemicals are available and what they'll need to produce themselves, right? If a plant is in an environment that has plenty of chlorine, it might not have to produce any of its own. It might actually have ways of stopping chlorine from going into its body, right? There are going to be different adaptations depending on these different levels. And so symptoms of mineral deficiency vary in plants and depending on what material is missing, but plants can be just like us. They can also be malnourished by not having the appropriate nutrients in their environment. And so proper plant nutrition generally involves relationships with other organisms, these symbiotic relationships between both plant and fungi, as well as bacteria. So for instance, we have these rhizobacteria, which are plant bacteria that live closely to the roots of plants, or what is known as a rhizosphere. And so those organisms are constantly exchanging materials with plants. And not only are they giving materials to plants, but plants are also providing materials to them. So for instance, these rhizosphere is all the soil that is closely surrounding plants. So for instance, this is a plant root. Each of these little molecules are rhizobacteria that are living on the plant roots and are able to actively exchange materials with that plant. Again, it's similar to our gut flora and our relationships that we have with them. Plants would not be able to have access to as many types of chemicals without these bacteria. Those bacteria would not be able to live without the sugars and the other nutrients provided and processed out by plants. And so they depend on sugars, amino acids, and organic acids from the plant. Remember that plant is helping break down the soil and release materials into the soil. So those magnesium and things like that, which is helping out the bacteria. But also because these bacteria are living close to the plant and living on the plant's roots, they can actually help get some of the sugars or nitrogen that they need from them. And so these symbiotic relationships allow bacteria to grow as well. In response, these bacteria not only provide nitrogen and things like that from the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle, but they also can produce antibiotics. They can help kill other types of plant roots or other types of maybe inhospitable or pathogenic bacteria. So they'll help produce antibiotics to kill and protect roots. Or in a lot of cases, these bacteria may need, say, chlorine or some of these other maybe chemicals that are more toxic at a larger level. And so they will absorb metals and other nutrients from the environment. And so there are two different types. So there's these endophiles, which are cells that are bacteria that live between cells within the plant. And so, they can actually live outside the roots, but they can also live within the roots. And so there's a very intense symbiosis that can occur. And so in the roots, there'll be this complex cocktail of microproductions as well as microbes and root secretions. And so there's this very complex, again, soil solution that's pumping out of roots and also surrounding roots. And so bacteria and fungi are all working together with plants in order to create this cycle of nutrients so that all of them can have the appropriate amount of amino acids and phosphates that it needs. And so, we talked about prokaryotes and their role in the environment. Bacteria do a lot in the nitrogen production of plants, right? Because plants need a large amount of nitrogen for proteins and nucleic acids, right? And so the nitrogen cycle is this series of natural processes where nitrogen is taken from the air and soil and are made into different types of molecules useful for plants. So for instance, you have in the soil here, you have this organic material of humus that has these ammonia-fying bacteria. So you have bacteria that is taking nitrogen from the soil and creating ammonia. You also have bacteria that's closer to the top of the soil, which is nitrogen fixing bacteria. So they are actively taking nitrogen nitrogen gas, and then combining it, processing it, turning it into ammonia. You then have ammonia reacting with protons in the soil, collecting them and becoming ammonium. And so ammonium is one of the many ways that plants can uptake nitrogen. And so this will be directly absorbed through root hairs by certain species. But for others, they need it to be a little bit more processed. And so there are bacteria that are then going to take that ammonium and nitrify it and make it into nitrate, which can also be absorbed as another form of nitrogen for plants. And so they'll absorb nitrate and nitrogenous organic compounds and export them to the xylem and the shoot system, right? They're going to be taking that nitrogen and moving it up so that they can use it for their metabolic processes. You then have bacteria that are completing that cycle, right? So they're actually going to take that nitrate and they're going to denitrify it. They're going to remove nitrogen from it. And in that process, they're going to produce nitrogen gas and return it to the atmosphere. And so we have bacteria that are putting nitrogen in the soil and removing nitrogen from the soil. And so generally speaking, this process is what limits most environments. So plants are often not limited in their growth based on the sunlight or water. They generally are limited by the amount of nitrogen that is able to be produced in these soil environments. And so again, we need bacteria in order to create nitrogen, and then we need plants in order to continue this process and feed other organisms. And so without these bacteria, these prokaryotes, and without soil, there is no environment. And so as we learned about prokaryotes and their role in the environment and bacteria, they make diverse methods of nitrogen available. They also make all of these other materials such as phosphorus and things more readily available for organisms. Nitrogen fixation, soil fixation, ammonifying, all of these things are different ways that they can add nutrients to the environment in ways that other organisms can deal with. And so nitrogen fixation, you have nitrogenase, which is plants need a lot of carbohydrates from decaying materials and root secretions and such like that. But you have nitronase, which is, an enzyme that breaks down nitrogen. If, ACE is generally an enzyme of some point. And so you have gaseous nitrogen, some type of electron source and proton source. You're then using ATP, a lot of ATP, 16, breaking it down into ADP. And so then you're creating these different types of nitrogen sources and hydrogen, as well as breaking apart phosphorus and things like that. And so bacteria transfer nitrogen from the air into ammonia and then decompose nitrogen from dead materials, which makes it accessible for plants, right? They're doing decomposition as well as nitrogen fixation. And so this is mutualism because both organisms are benefiting, right? This is a symbiotic relationship. And so by providing appropriate nitrogen to an environment, you create drastic changes in root structure, right? So for instance, these nodules are areas of roots that have been infected by bacteria. And so these bacteria are going to be working with the plant and helping provide nitrogen to them. And so these little tumor-like things are actually growths on the roots that are leading to, bacteria blocking themselves, right? They're going to be undergoing nitrogen fixation. So they're not going to want to be exposed to oxygen, right? So they're going to want to be encased in something and hide from the oxygen that is theoretically in that soil and surrounding them. And so in each nodule, these bacteria work within vessels and formed root cells. And they need that anaerobic environment in order to undergo nitrogen fixation, or oxygen is just going to take those protons and it's going to be too much. And so interestingly enough, you may not think about it, but plants have this legoglobin, which is a blood pigment, we talked about, and it's like hemoglobin, but it appears in these nodules. And it's kind of like that blood solution, but for plants, in which bacteria are living in there and they're exchanging nutrients with their environment. And once again, they need this kind of blood pigment because this is going to be blocked from the outside world, right? These nodules are trying to not deal with oxygen. They're trying to be isolated to undergo nitrogen fixation. And so they need to be pumped full of nutrients by the plant and by, each other working as a biofilm. And so it allows, again, oxygen to be held, which actually helps pull oxygen from the bacteria. So you have this blood pigment. And so instead of, the blood pigment being used to provide oxygen to the bacteria, it's actually pulling the oxygen out of the area, which allows the bacteria to live in an oxygen-free environment. So it helps fixation occur by creating, pulling the oxygen away from it. And so bacteria will then live in those root complex, just like they live in our gut flora, allowing plants to survive. And so, you have fungi that are also working with plants, right? You have these root fungus. And so the root fungus actually is very interesting. So they will embed themselves once again in the roots of an organism. And by embedding in between the cells, they can actually help provide nutrients from the outside back into the cell. So there's another mutualistic relationship. So the fungus is provided sugar by the plant, right? The plant is going to be pumping sugar throughout its body using the phloem. And so these fungus are able to tack into that. They actually go in between the cells of the plant and they can absorb sugar through that plant. And so they actually extend into the mantle of this organism. And so with this increased surface area, they actually help provide more water for plants. So if you look at the root structure of a plant with and without fungus, it's a lot more elaborate when you have fungus there. Roots can grow thicker and they actually become more branched. Because again, the fungus is growing and then the fungus is providing different types of decomposition as well as nutrients in the soil. And so the two are living off one another. It'll also provide phosphorus and other materials absorbed in the soil. So again, any excess material that the fungus have, they are going to be allotted and be taken by the plant around it. And so you have two different types of fungus. You have those that form a sheath and cover the roots of the plant. And then you have ones that are embedded like this, actually inside the different types of cells. So this one here, they are dense sheath. They're covering the plant root, and then they're digging inside. And then for this other one, the arbuscular ones, they're actually inside the cells, right? They're actually going and digging inside the cells of the plant and becoming part of it. And so there are many different types of these mutualistic relationships that are occurring in the environment and in the soil. And so the last thing I'll talk about real quick is the idea that, not all environments have full nutrients, right? So for instance, plants that are carnivorous, such as pitcher plants and Venus flytraps, things like that, those are actually plants that live in very low nitrogen soils. And so they can't naturally get nitrogen in the way that plants normally do this relationship with the soil through this bacteria. Perhaps there's not enough nitrogen fixation, or the soil in itself won't hold on to the nitrogen well enough. Perhaps there's water flowing through, taking those nitrogen things out. And so how do most other organisms get nitrogen? They eat other organisms. They eat plants. They eat other herbivores or other mammals, things like that. And so carnivorous plants are plants that have adapted to low nitrogen solutions by learning to eat other organisms in a way to get their nitrogen. So, they become predators just like us. If you were to put nitrogen into the soil of carnivorous plants, I'm not exactly sure what would happen. It might poison them, to be honest. I'm not sure what kind of mechanisms they have to absorb. It could overwhelm them. Or to be honest, it might just cause other plants in the environment to grow. For instance, if you have enough nitrogen, perhaps you're going to have weeds and other plants that normally can't grow in the low nitrogen environment sprouting up. And so it's possible that these species could get pushed out of their environment because, something that is growing, off nitrogen might be a root grower. So it might be able to sustain in a lot more environments, or perhaps it's able to spread more seeds and overpopulate. And so I'm not sure what happened, but probably something along those lines. All right, and so the last thing I'll show you is this video on pitcher plants because they're so cool. We actually have in the... Oh, I think this has just been playing the whole time. All right. Boom. Right, so we have... there we go. Let's share this. Things like that.
Dad, sometimes it takes a wrong turn to get you to the right place. But landing up in this nightmarish neighborhood is purely a stroke of bad luck. For these Venus flytraps are hungry flesh.
Flush.
With just a touch to one, and then two of the microscopic hair triggers, the plant's jaws trap the prey, setting in motion a bizarre all-in-one digestive system. The sealed pod floods with a lethal brew of digestive juices. Its mouth becomes its stomach, and finally its intestines, as it absorbs the nutrients. But this isn't the most efficient system, for a missed meal means energy wasted. High up above the flytraps, fellow carnivores, the pitcher plants, are a little more proficient. They're passive hunters firmly rooted in one spot. These plants make no attempt to hide in ambush. Once on the lip, the insect is as good as dead. Downward facing hairs prevent a good foothold. The toxic nectar drugs them. Deep, waxy walls make it too slippery to crawl out. Others are also fighting for their lives. All the while, without their knowing, they're already part of the digestive process. Their remains will soon become part of the existing graveyard. The greatest guzzlers belong to the tropical pitcher family. Sporting deep tubular pits filled with flesh-dissolving enzymes, it's like an open-ended stomach. Any animal small enough to fit through the mouth of the death pit is fair game.
Ooh, sorry.
Victims die by drowning, while their flesh slowly dissolves.
Right. So another fine example of nature always finds a way to survive. Right. Plants have that's heartwarming. Yeah. So that's all I have for you today. Let's see. What exactly is the date for the Unit 6 quiz? Is it on Monday? No. Right? What is the date? Oh. Actually, I guess since your finals on the 27th, 26th. Yeah. Yeah, so we'll have it on the 26th, and then you'll have, yeah, unfortunately, final the day after. But yes, the 26th. And that way I can have office hours on the 25th. Yeah, I can have office hours again on the 25th before your exam. There should be a study guide up, I believe I put it. So that should be good. The homework is to be due for Friday. All right. Do we have any other questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
For those digestive plants, like, where does the part that doesn't really get digested go? Like the exoskeleton and stuff.
Oh, for the plants? I'm not sure what happens to the bodies of a lot of those organisms. I'm sure they slowly get digested and broken down. I would assume that they slowly get turned into some type of mush that gets absorbed.
I think they might honestly just like kill each of the pitchers after they're filled up too much. I'm not entirely sure that's true, but I have looked at pitcher plants before and seen them like start to die after a little while, and maybe that's because they've been filled up with too many carcasses. I mean, that's horrifying, but
that makes sense, right? Yeah, if the plant is continuously growing, right? So it can 100% just make new pitcher plants. So that actually makes sense too. If it absorbs all the nutrients it can, and then it just, kind of like hypersensitive response, cuts off that part of the plant and then grows a new one. That makes sense. That's a good point, Gwen. Yes, so there will be recapture for 5 And 6. I don't know if there's enough time so in order for us to both grade that and the final and and allow recapture. So definitely for 5, I'm going to get you your grades to between today, and I'm going to be finishing hopefully tomorrow and today the grades for quiz 5, and so you can have recapture due next week for that. And then for quiz 6, we can have recapture due during finals week if you would like to follow up on that. So there won't be any recapture for the final, but there will be for quizzes 5 and 6.
On the syllabus, it says that the quiz is supposed to be Monday the 24th, not over the study period.
Oh, yeah. Originally, that's what we did for the synthesis day, but I liked moving it just so that there were office hours so that we can do a study sheet. If you have a reason that you like need to take it on like the 24th or something, if you have other things, email me and we can set that up individually, but I figured I would give you the most time to, study for it. Any other questions? Okay. If you think of anything, please email me. I have a meeting I have to go to right now with another student, but have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.